14. So the next real piece of business and topic to cover in class is cardiovascular disease. We've already talked about this a reasonable amount, I feel like, so far. But we're not going to get into, right, what's the actual thing that's wrong with you if you have different kinds of cardiovascular disease, okay? So we'll start class by doing this. So, Jenna, why do you think we should care about cardiovascular disease? Why do we think I'm spending time in class on this? We're going to go, we'll spend a couple of class periods doing this. Why do you think that is? Why is it important? Okay. It is not one of, right? It is the leading cause of death. So you're absolutely right, okay? We must care about cardiovascular disease because statistics tell us that there are 10 of you here in this classroom, okay? 11 if you count me. 4 of y'all are going to die from cardiovascular disease based upon the statistics, okay? 4. The most likely of those people are going to be Nick and I, okay? But that's the thing, all right? Look around you, 4 out of every 10 people die from some kind of cardiovascular disease. And there are very, very profound effects that we can have on cardiovascular disease by simply being more active and by exercising and doing a few things, okay? And so my goal by presenting all of this is going to be twofold, okay? First and foremost, I want you guys to learn about and understand for the different kinds of cardiovascular disease that exist, what is wrong with you, okay? What has happened to make your blood pressure go up? What has happened to result in coronary artery disease? You're going to get blockages in your coronary arteries. So what's wrong with you, right? And then the second big overarching piece from this is, if we know that this is what's wrong with you, and we know that exercise makes it better, then we need to understand how and why exercise makes it better, okay? Exercise will lower your blood pressure. Let's try to understand a little bit of why. Exercise prevents the development of coronary artery disease to some extent. Let's understand why, okay? With the ultimate hope then that you guys can take what you've learned from here off out into your lives, and you know, maybe at some point then 4 out of 10 of us won't die from it. It'll just be 3, or it'll just be 2, okay? At that point, Nick, I'm sorry, again, it's probably still going to be us, right? As you guys will see, men tend to be at a higher risk of developing cardiovascular disease than women. And so there's some things that go on there, okay? All right, so as we said, all right, it's about 40% of all deaths. There's about 180 deaths. I don't know why that jumped. Okay, about 180 deaths per 100,000 people in the U.S. per year. That number is not that important. Okay, the 40% number is important. The absolute number out of 100,000 is not. I'm just putting it there so you guys have it. Okay. The reason that it's so deadly is because it's amazingly prevalent. It's amazingly common. Okay, so about 80 million people in the U.S., and I forget what our population is. It's about 400 million or 450 million or something kind of in that particular range. So about 1 in 5-ish people have some form of cardiovascular disease, okay? And as you guys will see, people that are y'all's age, people that are under really the age of like 30 or even 35, typically don't have cardiovascular disease, which means that like you get to be my age and then like your parents' age, which may not be much older than me, but like your parents' age or your grandparents' age, everybody has cardiovascular disease of some kind, all right? And so we are going to look at and kind of group cardiovascular disease into several different kinds, although it's often going to be the case that if you've got one kind, you're going to have another kind too. They don't kind of occur in isolation that often. We'll talk about why that is. Okay? So that's going to talk about, we're going to talk about something called coronary heart disease or coronary artery disease, and this is specifically narrowing and blockages in the coronary arteries of the heart, and so that's going to lead to a lack of blood flow back to the heart, which is going to be really, really bad. Okay? So about 50% of all cardiovascular disease deaths are going to be the result of coronary artery disease. Okay. Stroke is going to be one. So about 20% of all of our deaths from cardiovascular disease are from strokes. We'll talk about high blood pressure. Okay. They're going to call it hypertensive disease. About 5% of deaths come from hypertension. The problem is that hypertension tends to be what we call comorbid, okay, with all of these other things. And all that means is if I have hypertension, I probably also have coronary artery disease. I probably have to have hypertension before I'm going to get to a place where I'm going to be in congestive heart failure. I probably have to have hypertension before I get to a place where I'm going to be at risk for having a stroke, okay? And so when you look at things, out of all of this, hypertension is going to be kind of one of the initial signs of things that are then going to potentially, if left untreated, lead us into these other ones, okay? And then about 6% of deaths come from congestive heart failure. We don't spend much time talking about congestive heart failure, but generally people that have congestive heart failure have been hypertensive and they've had coronary artery disease and they've had a heart attack or something and they've had some tissue death in the heart muscle, and so their heart is not strong enough to pump blood, and that's when you're going to have congestive heart failure. Okay? In the US, every year there's about 1 million, give or take 100,000 one way or the other, which is probably not a great margin of error, but there's about 1 million heart attacks that occur every year. We call them myocardial infarctions. So we'll talk about what that is, what it means, and kind of what the lasting effects of that are going to be. Okay. Okay. Any questions about that so far? Good? Okay. Sarah, if I say atherosclerosis to you, what do you think of? Plaque buildup in the artery. Okay, what's plaque? High cholesterol and just grossness, okay? In anatomy class, did you guys do any blood vessel dissections as part of all? Did you get to see arteries that have atherosclerosis in them? Yeah, Maddie, you're nodding your head. What did it look like? If I had an artery that has atherosclerosis. It looks chunky. Yes, I think it is gross, but like what, I'm trying to like, what is it that's in the vessel or what's happened inside the vessel if I have atherosclerosis? Mm-hmm. Okay, okay. So the next thing that we're gonna get at is atherosclerosis, which I wanna kind of prime you guys with on all of this, okay? I need you all to appreciate something about atherosclerosis, okay? Atherosclerosis is going to be an underlying condition, okay? This is the thing that is going to predict the development of a cardiovascular disease in the vast majority of cases, okay? If you have high blood pressure, it's because you have atherosclerosis. If you have coronary artery disease, I promise you, it's because you have atherosclerosis, okay? So, depending upon what book you read, who you talk to, atherosclerosis is not a form of cardiovascular disease per se. It is not in and of itself, okay, a disease. It is a condition or something that happens that is going to lead to and be the cause of these diseases. It's a process as well as kind of an entity and a thing, right? I hate to tell all of you, but every one of us has some level of atherosclerosis in some arteries in our body right now, okay? I hate to think about it, but my soon-to-be 21-month-old daughter probably has some atherosclerosis. Although I'm not sure she's ever had like like real sugar or like anything beyond like a hot dog in her life. And she may have a little bit. Okay, that may or may not be true, but that's kind of where we are. Okay, so here is our gross, fatty, junky-looking artery, right? This is what it looks like. So the idea of the development of atherosclerosis is, I hope, not that difficult to understand. okay? You eat fatty, cholesterol-filled things like Chick-fil-A because they're delicious and they're wonderful, okay? And then some things happen, and through some processes that are going to be exacerbated by obesity and being sedentary, we can get damage on this inner lining of a blood vessel, of an artery, and then that's going to lead to inflammation, and it's going to lead to us depositing some of that cholesterol and things as these plaques that Sarah talked about, okay, on the inside of the blood vessel. And so as that happens, the key thing is that when you deposit these fatty plaques, the inside of the vessel, the lumen of the blood vessel, is going to get smaller and smaller and smaller. Okay? So as it gets smaller, two things are going to happen. First, the pressure of blood moving through that vessel is going to go up. Okay? So if you have high blood pressure, one of the reasons may be that you're getting these blockages and narrowing of these arteries. It can lead to high blood pressure. The other thing that happens, okay, is because it narrows down, less blood is able to move through it in any one given period of time. So it may limit blood flow. Okay? So less flow, higher pressure, both of which can be dangerous. The other piece from this is, as it narrows down, there's a much smaller place that becomes much easier to get blocked off by a blood clot, or a piece of another fatty plaque that has broken off can get stuck in there, and it can completely block off blood flow through that vessel. Okay? And if that happens, depending upon where it's located, if it's in the brain, you're having a stroke. If it's in the heart, you may have a heart attack. Okay? If you're lucky and it's in an artery down in your lower leg, then you're going to get numbness. You may get some tissue damage and things, but it may not kill you. We may be able to rescue some of that. But if it's in the coronary arteries, it can cause a heart attack and death. If it's in the brain, it can absolutely cause a stroke, because it's much easier to block off those arteries because they're so much smaller. Okay? So this is one of the few things that you guys are just going to have to kind of memorize and learn from. But I think it's important to understand what we would call the etiology, or the kind of developmental process of atherosclerosis, how a fatty plaque develops and how it gets deposited. Okay? And we'll do this because I want you to appreciate some of the things that exercise and certain drugs and things can do to help prevent some of this. Okay? So atherosclerosis is a gradual process. We need to keep that in mind. Okay? As I said, all of us have some amount of this, okay, that's going on. It's very slow, it's very gradual, right? And it takes, tens and 20 and 30, 40 years for this to get to places where it may actually cause a problem. Okay? The initial thing that happens is there's going to be damage to the inner lining of a blood vessel, particularly your arteries. Okay? The inner lining of your arteries is called the endothelium. Okay? It's called the endothelium. So on the endothelium, which you can see I'm going to point to here, so this layer right here, this is the endothelium. Okay? The endothelium is very, very sensitive. It is going to send signals to the smooth muscle around these arteries and arterioles to dilate or constrict. It plays this very important signaling function, which helps us regulate blood flow and regulate blood pressure. So if there is going to be damage to all of that, that damage often tends to happen around what we call bifurcations in blood vessels. It's going to happen in places where blood vessels are splitting into two. Okay? They split, and as the blood moves through there, the blood becomes more turbulent, and things that are in your blood are, you got to remember, blood is water with a whole bunch of other little cells in it. and those cells and things are going to kind of spin around and get all jumbled around. They can smash into the wall, and sometimes they'll put little nicks in there. They'll have little lesions that are going to be there. Okay, so there may be damage to the endothelium. Okay, you get that damage here. Okay, we've got damage, and what's going to end up happening is, in that place where there is damage, we're going to get two things that happen. One, there will be inflammation. Okay, the body will mount an immune response like it does if you cut your skin. Okay, there's going to be an immune response. You will bring in white blood cells. Things like macrophages will come into that area, and part of what they're doing is they're there to try to repair and to heal the endothelium. Okay, the other problem with that, though, is that if you have consumed a high amount of, especially like LDL cholesterol and things, is you've got the cholesterol swirling around in your blood as well. You may get pieces of LDL cholesterol stuck in the lesion. Okay, so there will be infiltration of these fatty kind of molecules into there. And then that, in combination with the inflammation that's associated with the immune response, is then going to create something called a foam cell. Okay, it's going to create something called a foam cell. And foam cell is going to be these white blood cells that are eating and consuming this LDL cholesterol that are all going to be right there. Okay, so as we begin to form these foam cells, the body doesn't like it. It thinks this is not great. We need to either get rid of this completely, or if we can't get rid of it, we need to seal this area off from everything else. And in the process of trying to seal it off, it actually makes things worse. Okay? So we are going to go from having, okay, these kind of infiltration of these foam cells, which are going to be these LDL cholesterol molecules being eaten up by macrophages and things that get stuck in here, to the development of something called an atheroma. Okay? And so with an atheroma, what's going to happen is that you're going to get more and more accumulation of kind of fatty tissue in here, more and more macrophage infiltration into this area, and eventually then you are going to stimulate the smooth muscle on the outside here to kind of stiffen up this area in the vessel, okay? And it becomes very fibrous. And so you've got fat stuck in this kind of fibrous, kind of tough tissue, and that's how we're going to end up getting kind of this initial formation of our plaques, okay? And so then that happens over time, and it gets very stiff, and there's more and more fat that gets in here, and then eventually the body just says, okay, fine, screw this, let's just cap it off and try to block all of this out as best we can. And then that's how you end up with this edge that's kind of all capped off and much harder than whatever you did before. Okay? Now, we could, if we wanted to, we could go through more of the cellular processes that are happening in all of these kind of little developmental steps. But the key things that happen are damage, infiltration of lipids, and inflammation. Okay? And so there are a couple of things that are going to play a role. So if we can prevent some of the inflammation, and if we can prevent some of the damage initially, we can prevent some of the LDL cholesterol that's floating around, then we may have some ability to prevent some of this from happening. Okay? We'll talk more about that once we've talked about the other kinds of cardiovascular. How do we go about preventing some of these things? All right? You guys with me so far? We're doing okay. Some nods of heads, yes, no, maybe. I'm checking to see if we got anybody. Nope, no chats. Okay. All right. So let's talk about coronary artery disease then. Okay. So this is outside of hypertension. This is the most common form of cardiovascular disease, and it is by a large amount the most deadly. Okay. Coronary artery disease is most of the time the result of atherosclerosis developing in the coronary arteries, developing in those arteries that bring blood from the heart back to the heart. Okay? The heart is constantly beating, right? It needs lots of energy, it needs lots of oxygen, therefore it needs lots of blood. And as we develop atherosclerosis in these areas, then it becomes potentially more difficult for us to get blood flow back to the heart. And then if you get a blood clot or something, or kind of some sort of complete blockage in these arteries, what's going to happen then is that you cannot get blood past that blockage or that narrowing in the coronary artery. And so everything downstream of that, like all of the cardiac tissue that's downstream of that, is not going to get enough oxygen, it's not going to have enough nutrients, it's not going to get enough energy, and therefore that cardiac tissue may die. Okay? So the lack of blood flow to a tissue, the lack of oxygen to a tissue is called ischemia. Okay? It's called ischemia. So if you get cardiac ischemia, that means there's a place or places in the heart that are not getting enough oxygen. Okay? With a lack of oxygen, we can get tissue death. When there is tissue death, okay, or a lack of oxygen, if you get enough tissue death, then the heart doesn't function correctly and it cannot pump blood. The bigger issue is that oftentimes when there is ischemia and that tissue begins to get disrupted, is there is a disruption in the electrical signals through the heart coming from the SA node and the AV node. And as you get that arrhythmia, then that's going to potentially be one of the things that leads us to this myocardial infarction. Okay? When you have lack of blood flow here, one of the hallmark signs of coronary artery disease, the hallmark signs of a heart attack or infarct resulting from coronary artery disease, is something called angina. Okay? Angina is pain, but it is pain that is indicative of ischemia in cardiac tissue, but you don't feel it where your heart is located. Your heart does not have afferent sensory fibers, so despite what you think, your heart cannot ever actually hurt. Okay? So it borrows receptors from the surrounding tissues in many ways. So angina pain tends to be left side, like left side shoulder, left side like bicep, upper arm area, maybe up into your neck on that side. It seems to be more shoulder and neck in women and a little bit lower in men, which is weird, okay? But that's angina pain. In a lot of instances, you may have coronary artery disease, but you only get ischemia during times of high stress or exercise, okay? And you get noticeable sort of ischemia. And that's because you don't always have to work all of the cardiac tissue at its maximal level at rest. So it doesn't need as much oxygen at rest as it does during things where heart rate and stroke volume and cardiac output go up. Okay? And so a very common thing is, right, we're going to take Kayla, she's sitting here, she's fine, we have her start exercising, and she begins to experience angina pain. And then she stops exercising, and it all goes away again. Okay? And so then we're like, ooh, what's happening? Are you having a heart attack or not having a heart attack? So then she goes to the hospital, and we put her on a treadmill, and we make her exercise again, so we can try to make the angina pain come back, so we can pick up what's happening on an EKG. Okay? My mom was in the hospital this past weekend with what feels like numbness and angina pain for like the 5th time. It's never a heart attack, but of course you always have to go, right? You can't play around with those things. She has some narrowing in some places in her spinal cord, and she does something weird and like pinches those nerves a little bit, and it projects down where she has like facial numbness and kind of pain like down her left arm and things that looks a lot like angina, but it's not. Okay? But that's what's going to happen here. Okay? That's what's going to happen. So very often People have coronary artery disease, and you live with it for a long period of time before it will eventually kill you. Okay, and so we'll talk a little bit more about how we might treat that and some other things as we move forward. Okay, so these are just some pictures of the coronary arteries. I always love pictures like this where they've taken the heart and they've stuck dye and this kind of plastic stain stuff into all of the little blood vessels, into the arteries and the veins, and then they dissolved all of the cardiac muscle tissue. And so you can just see all of these blood vessels that are going to the heart. The heart is very, very, very vascular. And so you can imagine then, if you get some blockage in some of these larger coronary arteries, then there's going to be a lot of places downstream where we may have some issues. What you see now is something called a coronary angiograph. An angiograph is a specialized X-ray. It is often taken using, we've put dye, we've infused dye into your blood. And so what you can see here is you can see the outline of the heart, right, kind of on the X-ray here, okay? And then in the blood vessels, you can see some of these larger coronary arteries, and you can begin to see them kind of branching off out of all of that, okay? This one is from a relatively healthy, relatively normal function person that doesn't have kind of noticeable pronounced coronary artery disease. This one on the left. On the right, you are going to see this, okay? Now, part of the reason that it looks like the vessel has been pinched down is that X-rays don't show fluid very well. And so you put the dye into the blood, and the dye is going to show up on the X-ray. And so what that shows is not that the vessel has gotten pinched off. It's just that the vessel gets so narrow on the inside that you can't circulate much blood. It kind of gets shunted and pinched. The blood gets pinched off at that point. The vessel is still going to look like a regular coronary vessel. Okay? But this shows about 95% narrowing or 95% blockage of the left anterior descending artery. Okay? And so then you can imagine is that everything that is downstream of this, which is a lot of stuff, okay, is going to have markedly reduced blood flow. So if you have near complete blockage way upstream in these largest of your coronary arteries, then you can have a large amount of cardiac muscle that can become ischemic, and that can lead to really bad outcomes from myocardial infarctions. Okay. Questions about any of that? You guys good? Okay. So let's talk a little bit about risk factors for the development of coronary artery disease. Who is at risk of developing this? And the short answer is really everybody. Okay? It's really everybody. It's very, very common. All of us are going to have some probable level of atherosclerosis in our coronary arteries, but maybe not a huge amount. We want to limit as much as we can. So we have what we call primary and secondary risk factors. A primary risk factor seems to be something that we think directly may lead to the development of this. A secondary one is going to be something that in and of itself is not necessarily associated with the direct development of atherosclerosis or the direct development of coronary artery disease, but people that have it seem to also have these other things. Okay? So, primary risk factors: smoking. Okay? Smoking is one. High blood pressure. Okay? High LDL cholesterol levels, low HDL cholesterol levels, high triglycerides. Being sedentary or being physically inactive, being obese. Okay? Do these things here as risk factors look familiar to you guys? Chandler, you're nodding yes. Where do you think you've seen those before? They're the same thing as with any health problem, okay? Did we have you guys ask your friends to do something where they might have gotten asked questions about that? Right? So Megan was nodding her head. These things here that are risk factors for coronary artery disease, These are the things for which we screen when we do exercise kind of safety screening, okay? If you smoke, you tend to have high blood pressure. That's one of the things there. Smoking can lead to more narrowing in the arteries, so it's going to lead to high blood pressure. If you have high blood pressure, it's probably the result of narrowing and atherosclerosis in your arteries, and you have high blood pressure, you've got a greater chance that you're going to have a blood clot somewhere. Okay? Both of which are bad if you've got blockage in your coronary arteries. If you've got a poor blood lipid profile, especially high LDL cholesterol, there's more cholesterol circulating around to get stuck in these lesions in the blood vessels. Okay? I'm not going to talk about why LDL but not HDL, why LDL but not VLDL. We're not going to talk about those things. Just take my word that this is the bad one. Okay? Physical inactivity, also bad. We'll talk about that in a second. And then obesity. The issue with obesity is obesity seems to lead to heightened levels of systemic inflammation. Okay? Heightened levels of systemic inflammation. And so you may get a more pronounced inflammatory response to these little nicks in your blood vessels if you are obese compared to being a kind of normal weight person. Okay? And so that can lead to problems. If you are obese, you are probably also going to have this elevated LDL cholesterol levels. And so those things together are going to put you at a greater risk for this. Being sedentary also seems to lead to heightened levels of kind of inflammation. And the better answer is probably that being more active lowers inflammation, right? It lowers the inflammation. Being more active will lower blood pressure. Being more active lowers LDL cholesterol. So there's some interaction with all of these things, okay? Some of them are a chicken and an egg kind of thing, but these are our primary risk factors, okay? These are the primary risk factors. Most people, as they get to be, say, your parents' or your grandparents' age, are going to have a lot of these things, okay? We've done a pretty good job as a country of trying to yell at people, shame people, beg people, bribe people to get them to stop smoking. We should probably do the same to try to get them to not eat as many things that have as much saturated fat so they have LDL cholesterol, to get them to get out and be a little bit more active. This is the one, the activity piece is the one thing that can kind of help us subsume all of this. We'll talk about that a little bit later on. Okay? Secondary risk factors are having diabetes, especially for type 2 diabetes. Almost everybody that's a type 2 diabetic probably also has, they're probably obese, and they very likely also have coronary artery disease. They occur together a lot. A family history of heart attacks or something, being a dude, okay, and then being older. Being male, being of advanced age, tends to play into hypertension, okay, to more of an extent there. And then a family history means you may have some genetic factors that lead to elevated blood pressure. Some people just have a more difficult time metabolizing LDL and may be more prone to being obese. Okay? So those are our risk factors. Not a great place to be. Okay? So if you can imagine, 70% of people in the US are physically inactive, right? Our obesity numbers, right, it's like 70% are overweight or obese, like a third to about 40% are obese. So is it any surprise then that, so many people have coronary artery disease? Okay. All right, let's take a little break. We'll take 5 minutes or we'll take 6. We'll come back at 12:15. Okay? Back at 12:15. Okay. So these are some data, and I want to show you guys kind of the hierarchy, if you will, of kind of the importance of these various risk factors to the development of coronary artery disease. Okay? And so what you can see here is the percentage of the U.S. population that is going to be at risk for developing coronary artery disease based upon, okay, the various risk factors. And so this is not to say, in some ways, that which one of these is the most dangerous to the people that have it. This is going to, in some ways, try to show the percentage of people like in this room that are likely to have this particular risk factor. So if you will look, okay, about 10% of the population has high blood pressure, okay? That's going to be systolic pressure over 150 millimeters of mercury, right? That's going to double your risk of coronary artery disease. Its risk ratio is 2.1. So about 10% have high blood pressure. About 10% have higher serum cholesterol. So you have high total cholesterol here. That's about a 2.5% increase in things. About 20% of the population smokes. Okay, that's also about a 2.5% thing. That's if you smoke a pack of cigarettes today. That feels like a lot. I don't know much about people that smoke. Do you guys have friends who smoke? Is a pack a day like a huge amount? I mean, you'd spend like $100 a week on cigarettes or something, if that's the case. But anyway, and then you will also note then that this says 60. We're probably closer to about 70% now of people that are not getting physical activity. So it's not quite as bad for you, right? The risk ratio is a little bit under smoking or high LDL or high blood pressure, but it affects so many more people, okay? It affects so many more people. And so that in some ways is the idea behind kind of like what's happening with the coronavirus right now, is that it is not by itself in a vacuum like as deadly in some ways as the flu or some other kind of like Ebola or those things, but it's so infectious that if you're going to infect millions and millions more people with this than something else, then even though its death rate is like less than 1% or kind of right around there, 1% of a big number is still a lot more people than 4% of a much smaller number. Does that kind of the math of that make sense to you guys? That being sedentary is one of the primary, like kind of the biggest risk factor, because many more people are sedentary than are these other things. And as you guys will see later on, being inactive in some ways makes cholesterol and blood pressure things worse. Okay, and so there's a lot of people that are going to be worse off because of this. Okay, so here remember we talked about these before, these are the ACSM risk factors as part of our health screening for cardiovascular disease, and almost all of these things, these are the risk factors for coronary artery disease. So when we're screening people to exercise, what we are worried about primarily is, do you have coronary artery disease that's going to cause you to have a heart attack while we're exercising you today, right now? Okay, we're about to have lab. I'm going to have Bella come over here and get on the treadmill, and she's going to have to run for us, basically, and we're going to figure out what is her risk of having a heart attack while she's doing that. Okay. Bella, you want to run for us? You ready? You want to do it? You don't have to. It's okay. So we're going to be there. Okay. The good part of this, and the good part about our risk factors for coronary artery disease, are that exercise or increased physical activity can have a positive impact on 5 of the 7 coronary artery disease risk factors. Okay? So if you exercise and you're more active, you will not be sedentary. So we can remove this thing that affects the most people, we can remove all of that out of hand. Okay? Exercise seems to lower fasting glucose levels. That's a good thing. That's going to have some impact on a secondary thing of diabetes, okay, which is a secondary risk factor. If you exercise, it will lower your LDL levels, period, full stop. Okay? The more energy you burn in a given day, the more LDL cholesterol you're going to metabolize and turn into HDL cholesterol. Okay? So that's one of the primary ways that exercise exerts a lot of its benefit on atherosclerosis and coronary artery disease, and really all kinds of cardiovascular disease, is through the mitigation of elevated LDL cholesterol. Okay. Exercise lowers blood pressure, at least in people that are hypertensive. Okay. If you guys aren't hypertensive, we can take everybody's blood pressure. Anybody know what your blood pressure is? Anybody? Hannah's not in her head. Yes. Do you mind sharing, Hannah? That is HIPAA information, so you don't have to. Okay, 117/77. We could take Hannah and have her just run for weeks and weeks at a time. Her blood pressure is probably not going to go down very much because it's normal. It's in that normal range. You take a person that is hypertensive, say their blood pressure is 155 over, I don't know, 90 or 95 or something like that. They're probably going to get somewhere between like an 8 and a 10 millimeter reduction in blood pressure. So it may not take them all the way back down to normal, but it's going to exert a reasonably profound effect. Okay, so if you are hypertensive, exercise can lower it and thus kind of knock out or mitigate some of that as a risk factor. And then the last one is somewhat controversial depending upon who you talk to. And it depends upon how you word this. There is some evidence that people that are more active tend to not be obese as often as people that are sedentary. Okay? That doesn't mean necessarily that exercise is going to always be sufficient for weight loss or the prevention of weight gain and those things. And there's kind of some other behavioral factors that tend to kind of pour into that. But exercise can limit obesity. The other thing that it does, as we've already talked about, is even if you are obese, being physically active seems to negate a lot of the negative effects of obesity. Okay? So your elevated risk of all-cause mortality and cardiovascular disease-related mortality seems to be mitigated. So if I'm active, you can almost just take obesity and forget about it as a risk factor. Okay? You probably shouldn't. ACSM will get mad at me for telling you that, but there's plenty of data that you can kind of counteract most of any negative effects from being obese just by being active. Okay, so part of the thing that happens, okay, and part of the good thing that happens is here we have, and I don't know why Dr. Pinku picked out our monkeys. We have our sedentary poker playing monkey, and here we have our ice skating hockey playing monkey. I don't really understand where those pictures came from, but this is what a coronary artery in a, say, a 55-year-old sedentary person might look like, and in a 55-year-old person that's been a lifelong exerciser. Okay, you will note significant plaque deposition here in this artery, significant narrowing because of that. And you will note in our exercising person, not only do they not have a lot of plaque deposition, or really in this instance, any plaque, which is probably not exactly accurate, we have a little bit, okay? Almost no plaque deposition, but also the artery is bigger. You could fit the entirety of this artery inside that one. And so one of the other things that exercise does that is useful for preventing coronary artery disease, yes, it prevents atherosclerosis by limiting inflammation, okay, by limiting and lowering LDL cholesterol levels and those things. But it also leads to a process of what we call vascular remodeling. With vascular remodeling, your blood vessels get bigger, okay? The blood vessels get bigger. When I was a master's student, we would take a Doppler ultrasound machine and we would measure blood flow in people in their femoral arteries. And to do that, you would have to visualize the artery. We would measure how wide the artery was. We'd measure the velocity of blood at rest moving through the artery and those things. And some of the most fascinating things that you would see is you would get people that were these sort of very small, highly aerobically trained individuals that you would test like distance runners. And they would have these giant, massive femoral arteries with blood flow that would just kind of creep through, okay? great big pipes, as we would call it. And then you would have folks that were like much larger individuals, sometimes these resistance trained guys, great big people that you would think, well, their body size is bigger, shouldn't their blood vessels kind of scale up to body size, and they would have these smaller blood vessels, okay? So exercise, especially aerobic exercise, leads to vascular remodeling, which makes the arteries bigger, right? Bigger arteries means there's more space that has to be filled up by the plaques before you're going to get a decrease in blood flow. Okay? And so that's also a really, really positive outcome. Okay? Questions about that? You guys are doing okay? Okay. So let's, for the sake of kind of clarity of things, let's just stop there. Okay. We'll pick up. We've talked about angina a little bit. Once we get past angina, then we're going to get into a couple of the other talking about heart attacks and things. So we'll save that for next Monday. Okay. I've not forgotten about the lab data, but I've gotten busy doing a couple of other things the last couple of days. I'm hopeful that by tomorrow I will get everybody matched up with someone for some skin folds from the previous data, and then I'm working on rewriting the lab so you guys have some more clear instructions on what to do with all of that. So don't worry. Once I post the data for you, you'll have a week after that to be able to do the lab. Okay, so it's not like we did lab on Monday that something is due next Monday, and I'm cutting into y'all's time to get it done by being a slack ass and not getting the data to you. So once you get the data, which will hopefully be tomorrow, you'll have a week to get it turned in. Okay. All right. A quick question: you guys have seen that I've entered grades for like your other labs. I've entered grades for the resistance training critique. For those of you that missed some points in places, I put a little. Canvas lets you put a comment in by the grade. Do you guys get notified that that's there? I just started doing that this semester. I was like, oh, this could be a useful thing because we get people that, it's hard for me to like write stuff on there and then hand it back for people that are only coming via Zoom. So I just didn't know. But you guys can see that? Okay. I will keep, if that's okay, I'm going to keep kind of doing things like that. Okay. But in general, y'all are doing very well with the labs. You're doing good making the graphs. You guys almost exclusively did really well on the resistance training critique. We will do an aerobic training program critique, but that will probably be, we'll do hopefully lab that will be due next week, and then we'll make the aerobic critique due the week after that. We'll kind of space things out so you guys aren't working on things all together. I've not forgotten about it. We're not in a huge rush to get it done. Okay? Cool. All right. Well, you guys have a great rest of the week. Have a good weekend, okay? Keep making good choices as our COVID numbers spike. So